Welcome! So today I thought we would talk about the overview of American literature. So we're going to learn what this course is all about. Basically, everything literature-wise that we will be learning during this year, okay? So I'm going to introduce you to all of that by giving you an overview of the literary movements in American literature. So let's do that. Let's get started right now. So the purpose of going over the literary movements of American literature is to help prepare you, obviously, for your end of course exam or your SOL. SOL means Standards of Learning. EOC means end of course. Okay. So the first literary movement we're going to talk about today is the Puritan literary movement, or colonialism. This was 1600 to 1700s, and during this literary movement, they left England in 1620 and they came to, where we are now in the Americas, or in the United States, known as America. They came to the New World to create a utopian society where they could create their own belief system that was separate from Catholicism. Okay, so you have Protestants or Protestants. And that's where the Puritans came from, essentially. All right, so they came here so that they could freely practice their beliefs. Okay, and in the 1600s, 1700s, Puritanism, colonialism, the focus was on, there was no separation of church and state. Was a extreme focus on God and spirituality and religion. This was, part of daily life. Individuals in the community, or Puritans, lived their life on this notion of predestination. The idea that you were predestined to go to heaven or hell. Basically, that God has already decided who was saved and who was not. So you are basically living an entire life of, please take me, sort of like fire insurance. If I'm good here, maybe he'll save me, that kind of lifestyle. Basically the idea behind predestination, God already decided who was saved and who was damned. Okay, but the real kicker in all of this is that, no one really knew on earth. No one knew. So that's why they just acted the best they could in hopes that they would be saved. And the idea also behind predestination is that, we are inherently evil and that, being good takes work. Strive to be good. Forced into this righteous sort of lifestyle. So a few authors we're going to look at during this time period are Anne Bradstreet, who wrote some poetry, and another author, Jonathan Edwards. He wrote a very famous sermon that served in the Great Awakening to be one of the most famous, awakenings, I guess. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So we're going to be looking at those pieces of literature in this literary movement. We will also be looking at a piece of literature called The Crucible by Arthur Miller. And, this was written during a different time period in the 1950s, but it does echo a lot of the themes that are present in the Puritan and colonial time period, because it takes, the Salem witch trials and, this whole Puritan ideals and so forth. So we'll be looking at Arthur Miller as well. Okay, the next literary movement is called the Revolutionary Literary Movement. And it is exactly how it sounds. It sounds of rebellion. It sounds of revolution. And this was the mid to late 1700s. And during this literary movement, there was a shift in government. It was democratic now, and it was moving more away from religion. Granted, it was still religious, but they were moving, further away from religion. So there was a shift in scientific thinking and into more experimenting and moving away from those really sort of strict ideals from the previous movement. They were striving to gain independence from Britain, and so therefore there was a lot of rebellion. In order to receive reimbursement from the crown or from Britain, England kept troops in America after the French and the Indian War, which was in the early 1700s. So, why do you think that would be important? Well, money is a big driving force. And a lot of the complaints about King George were falling on deaf ears, meaning they weren't giving them money. So that money is always the source. So the idea of no taxation without representation, that fell on deaf ears from King George III. Okay, because it's all about the money. Going to take a closer look at some speeches during this particular time period. Early 1700s, mid to late 1700s, authors like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Phyllis Wheatley. Transcendentalism, early to mid 1800s, very interesting historical component here. We have westward expansion, we have the Louisiana Purchase, and the rebellion, even more so against Puritan beliefs. We've got the belief in democracy and freedom, and the ending of the Civil War. This literary movement, if you look at it like in a broader spectrum, this is actually also part of Romanticism. Transcendentalism is sort of like a subsection of the Romantic literary movement. It's not really a standalone. In this particular literary movement, we have themes like God is nature, nature is God. It's very esoteric. It's very, you are one with the universe and you are one with nature. And the idea that in order to become more spiritual, you need to go out into the actual world, like as into the forest or the wilderness, and you need to become one and free your spirit there and commune with nature, which means to spend time in a spiritual way in nature and become closer that way in order to, transcend, get it? Transcendentalism, in order to transcend to that next level of yourself. Some other ideas present that authors talk about are things like being self-reliant and relying on yourself to, be the victor in your life or to be victorious or successful. The idea of standing up for what you believe in and not just going with the flow of society, but actually considering, hey, what's right and what's wrong? What do I believe in? Instead of just absorbing what everyone else is just doing. They believed that you have to be an individual and you can't just say you're an individual, you actually have to do something that's true to yourself to really be an individual. Their ideas are embedded, like Thoreau. We're going to look at authors like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was considered the father of Transcendentalism. He started it, I guess you could say. He's the father of it. But anyway, there are themes in the literature that suggest that you have to be brave to really truly embrace who you are as a person. And they explore this in their literature. And then we are going to go more so into Romanticism, early to mid 1800s, and explore some other themes during this time period where it's an even greater rebellion against the Puritan ideology that existed in the previous history. And during this time, the Romantic authors wanted to examine the relationship between, man and nature, man and emotion, the idea of inspiration. It is what it sounds like, romantic, not just in the sense of love, but in the sense of spirit and existence, and nature's part in it also, but the idea of the individual's part in it also, and what makes someone an individual. That's why we say man and emotions. And they embody pretty much the same philosophy as transcendentalists, and they have this very strong connection or fascination with the supernatural, and things like the Moors, or Gothic type machinations or forces. The idea that everything has like a dark side, and that that's part of what started the American Gothic movement, was this idea that there is a dark side. So you'll see themes of darkness in like the architecture of buildings, the interiors of buildings, nature, the person or the characters, their thoughts, ghosts and monsters and things like this. That's part of that darker side that I'm talking about. So that supernaturalness. And we're going to be looking at authors like Edgar Allan Poe and Emily Dickinson and Walt Whitman. They've got some really interesting pieces of literature out there that are worth taking a closer look at. Then we will be looking at literary movements like realism and naturalism, mid to late 1800s. They attempt to mirror real life situations, you get that grit of life, and it reflects careful observations of life, more so though with the working class. So there's just not a lot of fluff. Now when you think of romantic writing, you have to think about, it's romanticized. Have you ever heard that term, romanticized? It means there's a lot of fluff, a lot of like aristocracy, and a lot of, we're only going to talk about the rich and all of the posh things and all of the bougie stuff. Okay, that's like romantic writing. But then you have realism that's talking about the working man or the working woman, or the child laborer, or that kind of thing. Okay, so life is depicted as gritty and real. Okay. And it's basically the movement is a study about how, life is created by our environment, and they look at how we as people are affected by our environment and what happens. What's the daily life look like for people who are in these particular situations, whether it be a factory, job that's 12 hours a day, or something else like a chimney sweeper. And one of the focuses in this literary movement is this emphasis on human instinct and what we do when we're in XYZ situations. They try to give highly descriptive settings to recreate that environment for the reader. This is in order to capture this time and place in history in great detail. So they do a very good job of that within the writing, the authors do. We focus on middle to lower classes now, whereas in the Romantic period, we focused on the upper class or the aristocracy. Now we're focusing on, lower classes and what that looks like. And we're going to be looking at authors like Mark Twain and Stephen Crane and Kate Chopin. We might cover a few other ones in there. Sometimes I like to substitute Stephen Crane for something else. It just depends on the class and what I feel people are interested in reading during this movement. During realism, I find that students really, really like the writing because it's written a lot more plainly, the languages, versus Romanticism, where the language is very flowery and there's lots of big, hard to understand, long, tangly sentences in Romanticism, whereas in realism, you get like very simple sentences, very simple language, and this is where kids kind of start to really enjoy the reading a lot more because it's more what you're used to, with the modern type of writing. Moving on, we are nearing the end here, and we are moving into modernism. Modernism is early 1900s to World War I, and we have an experimentation with all of these new styles of literature, especially poetry. A lot of up-and-coming poets who are experimenting with capital letters and punctuation and form and structure. And we have a search for love and emotional connections. We have a destruction of order and the end of World War I during this literary movement. It becomes very interesting to read and learn about these authors like Ernest Hemingway, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and you've probably heard of Hemingway. We're going to take a look at some of his literature. We're also going to take a look at F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which is one of my favorite novels. It is a slow startup. I'd say about page 75 I usually become interested, but yeah. And we're going to take a look at him, and we're also going to take a look at some T.S. Eliot and maybe a few others in there along the way. So it should be a really good time, honestly. So again, 1900s to World War I, and also during modernism, there is a subsection called Harlem Renaissance. This was in the early 1900s. We're talking like the 1920s. We're talking about a surgence of African-American artists, writers, performers, musicians. It is an African-American literary movement. It's absolutely full of really robust writing and music and poetry, just amazing. And New York, in Harlem, New York, it served as the mecca for this literary movement. Subsection for this time, okay? It's a subsection of modernism, but it's known as the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, and you'll hear a lot of assertion of racial pride and justice and appreciating the culture and a real viewpoint from what it's like to be an African American. So that's a lot of the themes in this type of literature. It's very enjoyable to read to get another's perspective. And we are going to look at authors like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, another one by the name of Countee Cullen, and a couple others. And then last but not least is the literary movement called Postmodernism. Postmodernism is about World War II to the present day. So in this literary movement, it's very much a reflection of the sorrow of war, and the optimism that's embedded. It's kind of contradictory, but they reflect on the optimism, but yet at the same time the sorrow of war. You have this idealism versus pessimism theme throughout the literature. You have literature that's looking forward, or in other words, like the science fiction-y type literature. And you have a very hard jump away from literary forms. We have authors experimenting with all kinds of different structure, not only with the form of different literary works, but also the sentences themselves. So we're going away from the old and coming into the new. And I think you'll find that with most literary movements, that is what indeed happens. From a previous literary movement to the next, they're always rebelling against what happened previously. That makes sense. And we're going to be taking a closer look at authors like Sylvia Plath and Nikki Giovanni and John Steinbeck and J.D. Salinger. Some really great authors in this time period. We might even take a look at, Ray Bradbury. So yeah, it'll be fun. And it's one of my from realism, naturalism on, it is my favorite time period to study literature, so it'll be a good time. So those are literary movements in American literature. I hope you enjoyed the ride. And yeah, so if you have any questions about any of the authors or the works of literature that we are studying, please check the module section on Canvas. And yeah, so I'll see you in my next one. All right, guys.